And I just wanted to start out first before Mara starts and say welcome to everyone who's joining us. And just some Zoom stuff for you is the way we're going to do it tonight is Mara will present, and then at the end there'll be a chance for questions. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put them in. We have a Q&A box. It's on like the little sidebar where you have different options if you're looking for it. If you just have questions that come to you, feel free to post them in there. And then at the end, we'll have some time where Mara can answer them. And yeah, welcome, and I'll pass it over to Mara.
Thanks, Savannah. And I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on the chat and Q&A. Just so, you know, with screen sharing, I might have a hard time. But with that, I am really excited to have you all joining this evening. I know the Zoom fatigue is real for me personally, so I'm sure you're feeling it too. And it's just great that you're all here, and thank you for making time to come learn a little bit about the Yampa River and my master's capstone work. As Savannah mentioned, I am Mara Chamlee. I am the Water Quality Administrator for MountainTrue Southern Regional Office, and I'm an Americorps member with Project Conserve and Conserving Carolina, also in Hendersonville. So just a note about this presentation before we jump in. I am here based in Western North Carolina, like I just mentioned, and I'm assuming most of you all here are. But this work that I am going to present to you all on was conducted out in Colorado. And it may seem a little bit strange that MountainTrue is hosting a webinar about such a far away river, but I can guarantee you it is one of the coolest river systems. Obviously, I'm not biased at all. But it is true that we can glean lessons about watershed management and stewarding our waters from systems all over the place. There are a ton of contextual and cultural differences between Colorado and Western North Carolina, but one thing that is pretty universal is the sense of pride and awe that our communities have in the natural resources that we are so lucky to have and benefit from these resources. So I will walk through the lessons that I learned from the communities that nurture the Yampa River, and then I'll take some time to apply that to a more uniquely Western North Carolina lens. Let's see. There we go. So a bit about me and this project. Again, this presentation is a recap of the research and activities that I completed for my master's degree from Colorado State University. This degree was focused on conservation social sciences. So the methods that I used in this project may not be what you typically think of around river research, like the sampling and measuring of water quality data and habitat data. But I would argue it's just as critical to have a firm understanding of these social forces that surround a river system, because that really influences how we are able as a community to take care of our waters in the long run. I completed this degree back in December. However, all the field work and research for this project were wrapped up at the end of summer, and I moved back to the Carolinas in September to start my current position as the Americorps Water Quality Administrator with MountainTrue in the Southern Regional Office and here in Hendersonville. So the work that I get to do on the Green River and French Broad River watersheds, it's incredibly rewarding, and it's so fun in that I get to think about what I learned from this degree and this capstone work and try to apply that to a very different system. So with that, let's dive into what this presentation is going to entail. I want to start with a pretty broad and centering background, since I know folks may not be super familiar with Colorado and water in the West. I'll cover my project partners and give some geographic and ecological highlights to start us off. And then we'll consider the combined social ecological systems that are at work in the Yampa Valley. And from there, we will dive into the conservation issue that is central to this capstone project. We'll take a look at what work my partners are doing, my organizational partners, and where my capstone fits into that overall work. And all of this will be setting the stage. A significant portion of this presentation will be setting the stage so that when I walk through the methodology and results, it all makes a little bit more sense, and we can think about applying this to the unique context of the Southeast. And then finally, at the end, I'll take some time to reflect, wrap up, and leave time for questions from you all. And like I said, I'm going to try and monitor that chat and Q&A, but going to do my best. So let's start with some background. My organizational partners for this project was Friends of the Yampa. They are a 501c3 registered nonprofit based in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, in the northwest corner of the state. It was founded in 1981 to develop widespread support for a healthy Yampa River from all folks and all communities that rely on the Yampa. They do unfortunately have a very small staff, and sometimes that means they have limited capacity. That makes it difficult for them to expand their reach in some ways, but regardless, they do really impactful work. And their mission that I just wanted to share with you here is, our mission is to protect and enhance the environmental and recreational integrity of the Yampa River and its tributaries through stewardship, advocacy, education, and partnerships. A few more notes on that, just really big picture here of what I got up to with Friends of the Yampa for my capstone work. I supported their efforts on the Yampa River Scorecard project, which is a project they're leading with multiple project partners in different agencies, nonprofit to local government to state government. But what I did with them was conduct lots of interviews with stakeholders and community members. And from the results of those interviews, I created an ArcGIS story map to shape the narrative of what I gleaned from those interviews. And that story map is not yet published, but it'll be housed on the Scorecard website when it is, and it'll serve as an educational and interactive tool. So the story map itself is an immersive tour, and the different sections and themes from the interviews coordinate with the different sections. And just a quick note here before I move on. A lot of the imagery and photos that you'll see in this presentation, I also use in that story map, but it was generously provided to me by Kemp Vertrees, who is a big time friend of the Yampa. He's their longtime chair of the board. And he's generously allowed me to use these photos to help make the story map and this presentation visually engaging and as exciting as possible, and really just to try and make you want to go visit the Yampa River and paddle sometime. So let's dive in, and I just want to take a quick minute to center ourselves around the fact that we don't often think about here east of the Mississippi, but this is just so central to water management in Colorado and on the Yampa. But that is the fact that the entire Colorado River Basin is in an intense and pervasive drought period. It's really been gripping the Western United States for about the last 20 years now. And drought is not always at the forefront of our minds here in the Southeast. Sometimes flooding is, but the drought in the West is causing a lot of turmoil for a lot of folks and a lot of fish. And that's why we need to take a look from the social side of things, since water use and water planning are inherently human-based activities. And this chart here that I've got pictured shows, it really demonstrates that since around 1999, not a single year has passed without part of the Colorado River Basin being in drought to some extent. And you can see that now at this point in time, 100% of is considered to be in drought, and about 80% of that is in the extreme or exceptional drought category. So don't worry, I'll move on. I'll get back to some of the doom and gloom when I get more in depth on the conservation issue, but that's just something I wanted to highlight up front. So the Colorado River Basin incorporates 7 states. Let's just take a quick look using the watershed boundaries and starting big picture, but those 7 states are Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California. And here the Yampa River is right up here in the northwest corner of Colorado. The Yampa is a major tributary of the Green River, which flows through Utah, and the Green River is the largest tributary of the Colorado River. So the Colorado River provides water to roughly 40 million people across those 7 states and Mexico. So the ongoing large-scale drought that is affecting many, many people and makes the future of water in the state of Colorado and all those other states really uncertain and difficult to plan for. So just another note to even further complicate that, water in the West is managed drastically different from water here east of the Mississippi, thanks to the intricacies of water law and tons of legislation. The water politics of the Colorado River system is just mind-boggling. So I won't get into it too much here, but I will briefly touch on some of the key things you need to know for this project. So back in the 1860s, the Colorado Doctrine was established, which is the water law framework for the state. In this doctrine, the concept of water rights was established, called the Doctrine of Prior Appropriation. And water rights in the West is a huge and sometimes contentious deal, but this doctrine details who is entitled to use how much water and for what uses they can use water for. It's often summarized as first in time, first in right, meaning that the first person to take water from the river system and put it to beneficial use, beneficial in quotes, there's lots of definitions, but that who takes the water out first has the first rights to that water allocation. So this system is central today to water users and differentiates senior water rights holders from junior water rights holders, and it dictates those allocation amounts. So if you thought that Colorado water law was cutting edge and progressive like a lot of their other policies, you'd be very wrong. It's still very much based on this 1860s doctrine. Zooming out or zooming in a bit, moving on to Colorado specifically, there are 9 major river basins within the state, and the arrows here give you an idea of how much water flows from each basin and where that flows. What I really want to highlight here and make sure you understand is the divide in the state that runs along the Rocky Mountains and divides kind of the Front Range, the most populated area, from the western slope, much more mountainous and sparsely populated, but that's the continental divide dictates which way the water flows to either the Pacific or eventually Gulf of Mexico. And you can see that, so this east slope versus west slope, you can see that the east slope waters flow here, and those numbers, the acre feet per year, are drastically different. It's critical to understand that this divide within the state, the geographic divide, creates a lot of tension between water users in the state and the different basins and their planning entities. So just taking a look at the numbers in these boxes here in the bottom corners, you can see that the population of the east slope, which includes the Front Range, Denver, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, that population is about 10 times that of the western slope. And in terms of water availability, by the numbers, are about 8 million acre feet per year that flows through the western slope, and about 1.3, just a fraction of that, 1.3 million on the eastern slope. So distribution of population and the distribution of water resources is very disproportionate, and that contributes to the tension between users and planners. So just summarizing that, more people and less water on the eastern slope. So let us take a look now at the Yampa River Basin itself. This map here on the left is the boundaries of the basin. We have here the Wyoming and Utah state lines. It shows the counties and major cities. The 2 counties we're interested in here are Routt and Moffat counties. Routt County is home to Steamboat Springs, which folks may have heard of, but Moffat County is home to Craig. And these 2 counties are very different politically, economically. Just we see a lot of different management practices come from those different ideologies and whatnot. But the second map here, I just like because it gives a clear picture of the course of the Yampa River itself. This first red star here showing the headwaters of the Yampa and then the second showing the confluence with the Green River, but it also shows you some of the major tributaries like the Little Snake and the Elk Rivers. Like I mentioned, those headwaters are super unique. I want to highlight here that there are the protected areas that are within the Yampa River Basin. The headwaters and the confluence are both in protected areas, but the headwaters originate in Drought National Forest in the Flat Tops Wilderness area pictured here. So you can see there are young little Yampas just meandering through floodplain through a very different ecosystem from where it ends up, which is at the confluence with the Green River and Dinosaur National Monument. This national monument is right on the state line of Colorado and Utah. It's just a gorgeous place. This is an aerial view of the confluence right here at Steamboat Rock. I just think this is one of the most incredible pictures, but here you can see the Green River, which is muddier than the Yampa, different compositions, but the Yampa comes in and it continues on down the canyon, down into Utah. So on that note, I want to take some time to look at some of the unique features of the Yampa River. The Yampa is unique because it's a model of a healthy river system, and that is due to the fact that it remains intact and free of major dams and diversions, which makes it one of the last free-flowing rivers in the entire Colorado River system, that whole 7-state basin that I showed you earlier. But the term free-flowing is sometimes debated because there are very small reservoirs in the headwaters area, but none of those reservoirs are so large like the scale of which we see all throughout other river systems in the Colorado. But there are some small agricultural, municipal, and industrial diversions up and down the river, but again, nothing so large as to alter the natural hydrograph of the river. And a hydrograph, I'll talk a little bit more about later on, but that is the rate of water flows over time. And the Yampas is a natural hydrograph because it maintains that cycle of peak flows and base flows. So peak flows from snowmelt in late spring and then dropping down to base flows the remainder of the summer. But because of that hydrograph and being free of large impoundments, in certain stretches you can clearly see the evidence of river movement. I'm going to bring your attention to this photo on the bottom right. You can see that river movement here. Generally, human disturbances like erosion and straightening of channels or dams and bridges can cause river movement, but here the movement is naturally occurring from flooding. So towards the bottom, you can see the scars of the oxbows, which are these big, large bends and meanders in the river. So those scars where the river previously flowed through and then over time migrated to where you see it is this day and age. In terms of biodiversity, there is a whole slew of rare flora and fauna. The riparian forest found along the stretch of the river pictured here, that riparian forest is called the Cottonwood Floodplain Forest, and it is recognized as a globally rare ecosystem. That ecosystem is a complex, that ecosystem is a major staging ground for the annual sandhill crane migrations. But in terms of other faunal biodiversity, this stretch is home to over 150 neotropical migratory bird species. It is also home to 3 federally endangered fish species, including the bony-tailed chub, the razorback sucker, and the Colorado pike minnow. There used to be 4 up until last September or October when the humpback chub was reclassified to threatened rather than endangered, which was kind of a big deal in the community. But these all these unique features, the flora and faunal biodiversity, this all should be a testament in and of itself as to why the Yampa River is just so remarkable and worthy of protection. But of course, these outstanding features, they do not exist in a vacuum. We also know that there's a whole slew of social components that influence the Yampa River system, which we consider in the perspective of social ecological systems. It is very much established that the water systems and watershed management, they're not only a natural physical science, but also a social science. So I pulled a quote from the literature review that I did in tandem with this project that I think gets at that concept really well. So Lund 2015 states that the consideration of the physical sciences as a sole basis for water management faces many limitations. Water management is a societal activity driven by social objectives. So taking a look at the economic side of things, the Yampa River supports so many different livelihoods in the region, and definitely the well-being of every single person that resides in the basin itself and beyond. Because obviously clean water is crucial for life. These economic considerations are a huge component of that. The ecosystem services that the Yampa River provides is just paramount to in so many ways. But two really big water dependent livelihoods in the region are agriculture and recreation, but also in terms of well-being, it's an enormous public health benefit to have municipal facilities that supply clean drinking water, stormwater control and wastewater treatment. But also you've got the industrial sector kind of represented here with this coal-fired power plant, but the industrial sector using water from the Yampa to provide energy to the region. So let's take a glance at the numbers of water use by sector. And this chart here is at the state level, and it's pretty representative too of the Yampa Basin. But agriculture by far and away uses the most at 87%. And the ag sector, this goes towards largely crop irrigation, which is mostly hay for cattle production and ranching, but the infrastructure that diverts and stores the water has to be maintained so as to not flood out the ranch or their neighbors or the whole landscape entirely. But a head gate for ditch diversions pictured here on the left, folks doing some inspections and upkeep and maintenance of that. But the municipal and industrial use is next at 7%. And those two, ag and municipal and industrial uses, those are considered consumptive uses, meaning that the water is largely, is permanently removed from the system. On the other side of things, non-consumptive uses leave water in the system, and that is oftentimes for the benefit of recreation and the environment. So these are known as in-stream flows, and that use is at about 6%, but in-stream flows ensures that there's water in the river for fish, there's water in the river so that you can float down the river, all that good stuff. So each of these sectors, they supply a lot of jobs to the region, and obviously each of these depends on a stable water supply. But agriculture, being the largest, and not only supplies food to the region, many folks view it as a cultural mainstay. It's a huge ranching community, ranching culture is viewed as really the heritage of this area of the state. Not adversely, but on the other hand, recreation opportunities draw tons of people to the area. Skiing is one of the biggest recreational uses known, but most folks are familiar with Steamboat as a big ski destination, but also paddling and fishing are really wonderful ways to get out and enjoy the Yampa River, and attracts a ton of people every year to paddle and fish. And with that, there are tons of outfitters to support those efforts. They really their livelihoods rely on being able to send people down the river and take people on fishing trips. But it is also worth noting here that coal is a huge part of Moffat County, and that is obviously changing in this day and age. The Hayden Station, pictured here on the left, is a coal-fired power plant, which is in the process of shutting down. They announced last year that they truncated the timeline for closing it. So shockingly, they will be closing by 2028, which means that a far-reaching economic shift will be necessary. And there is by no means an easy process, or there's not a one-size-fits-all sort of solution to that economic shift, but many people are looking to leverage the economic or the recreation and economic considerations that come from recreation and tourism, from the river itself, from the paddling and fishing opportunities. But Dinosaur National Monument itself is a big attraction, continue to focus some of that shift on the tourism sector, just to shift some weight to that from the energy production that we see currently. And shifting from the economic side of things into governance and policy, the dry fun stuff, we'll look at some of the governance structures and the policies that coincide with these structures that influence the Yampa's management. So the Colorado Water Conservation Board is a major player. It's a subset of the state's Department of Natural Resources, and the core of their work is to conserve and manage Colorado's water now and in the future, but it is an influential governing body to the water conservation process. And that's largely because CWCB gives technical and financial assistance to the next two areas that I'm going to talk about. So the Colorado Water for the 21st Century Act was passed in 2005, and it was largely a response to severe drought throughout the state in 2002 and 2003. If you can think back to one of those earlier graphs that I showed, the act established 9 basin roundtables in the state. Think back to that 9 basin region image that I showed earlier, but these are essentially stakeholder working groups, and there are representatives from all stakeholder areas on each roundtable, ag, recreation, industry. Largely, these groups were tasked with making locally informed water management plans, and those are called basin implementation plans. And these each informed the Colorado Water Plan, which was released in 2015. Each basin roundtable, each of those 9, created one of these basin implementation plans, and the group that was responsible for creating the plan encompassing the Yampa is the Yampa White Green Basin Roundtable. And as it turned out, most of the interviews that I conducted for this project were with folks who are either currently serving or previously stated serving on the Yampa White Green Basin Roundtable. And I learned, interestingly, in my interviews that the Colorado Water for the 21st Century Act was really the beginning of work of the Basin Roundtable. It was essentially a paradigm shift in the approach to water conservation in the state. I heard from quite a few folks that it really transformed the thinking and interactions around water management. The roundtable process is truly grassroots, and that's pretty unique because in most other states, water planning is done at the state agency level, but this is, you see these basin roundtables planning based on how much water and the population in each basin, so that they can adjust accordingly and inform the higher level of the Colorado Water Plan. So I think what I concluded from that and learning in these interviews that without the legislation of the 21st Century Act, it's doubtful that there would be the collaborative atmosphere around water in the valley that there is today. And a project like the Yampa River Scorecard project that Friends of the Yampa is working on, that I got to participate with, that wouldn't be possible. And that's not to say that the collaborative process is by any means unflawed, but there is more openness to collaboration around water principles. So after all that, let's see what some of those challenges are that the Yampa is facing. And bear with me, this is getting back to that doom and gloom part. I'm going to show you graphs, maps, headlines that can be a little discouraging, but do keep in mind that there are really many important people working tirelessly to create lasting solutions. So that drought that I mentioned that is gripping much of the West has obviously not escaped the Yampa, and especially this past year was an incredibly rough season. Colorado is a water scarce state that has seen reoccurring drought conditions, like I mentioned, for the past 20 years or so. We're also seeing enormously growing populations across the state, and that means more development and increased demand for an already scarce resource. So add to that the climate uncertainty that we're seeing, those wildfires that are popping up all around the West, just intense and detrimental. We're also seeing rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns. And this also means diminishing snowpack levels, which that snowpack is the source of water in the rivers throughout the year. But these sort of conditions reduce stream flow, they deplete the soil moisture, the groundwater levels, and that is ultimately felt in every corner of the state, economically and ecologically. This map here is from the US Drought Monitor, and it's just isolating the state of Colorado, and it's updated weekly, but this is from a 7-day window back in early September. The map did look like this for much of the summer and fall of this past year, with a lot of red and orange present, meaning severe drought or extreme drought. And this you can see in the northwest corner of the state, Drought and Moffat counties, where the Yampa flows in dark red, really the only corner or portion of the state that is in that dark red, the exceptional drought stage. A combination of those, of the drought conditions of high temperatures and low water flows creates conditions that are not favorable in any way, shape, or form for any part of the river system. This first figure here on the left, on the left shows the mean temperatures throughout the state, and this data is from the summer months of this past year, June through August 2021. But you can see that the scale on the right with record warmest at the top, and compare that, look at this northwest corner of the state, again, much of Drought and Moffat counties just inundated with that dark orange record warmest temperatures, which translates to higher water temperatures as well. The second figure right here is a stream flow duration hydrograph with the monthly percentile classes showing up as these different colors. So this shows the last 2 years of data. The black line shows the flow data. And you can see that for just about all of last fall and winter and all of this spring and summer, the flow has been in this orange and brown category, which are below normal and much below normal, and even right here dipping below that lowest 10th percentile range in one place. A little concerning, but high temperatures and low flows are not a good combination for the aquatic systems. As a result of these conditions, we've seen in recent years some unprecedented measures in the realm of water politics. We saw for the first time in history that the Yampa River was placed on call back in 2018. I'll get into what call means in just a second, but back in 2018, that was the first time ever in history since they instated that doctrine of prior appropriation back in the 1800s. But again, we saw that for the second time in history in 2020. And then one more time this past summer in 2021. And that was a brief call, but I do remember there was enormous monsoon that kind of brought it out of those call conditions, but still happened again for the third time in just 4 years. But like I said, that's just incredibly unprecedented, all of this happening right here for the first time in history in the past few years. But to describe a little bit more about what a call on the river means. A call on the river happens when there isn't enough water in the river for water rights holders to receive their allocated amounts. So think back to that first in time, first in right. So after that spring peak in flows, the river drops to base flows. And when base flows drop to a critically low level, we'll see that the senior water rights holders, oftentimes those are ag producers, they don't receive their allocated amounts. So in that case, the senior rights holders can call for their water based on the first in time, first in right priority system. And then those senior water rights holders will receive their allocation, but that doesn't necessarily mean junior water rights holders will receive their full or any allocation. But just to note, that does notably impact the agricultural community, especially when irrigating their crop fields. But just think back to how much water the ag sector uses. That's 87%. But on the other side of things, the recreation sector feels the sting of these conditions as well. For example, early in the spring season this past year, Colorado Parks and Wildlife announced widespread closures to recreation along the river. On May 24th this past year, CPW called an emergency fishing closure on high use areas, really below the Stagecoach Reservoir, up in the headwaters area. But they also, on July 8th, they enacted a commercial and voluntary recreational closure on the river. And that means that all commercial outfitters for tubing, rafting, stand-up paddleboarding, fishing guides, they all had to stop their trips down and on the river because there was not enough water in the river to maintain the healthy level for fisheries and those conditions. But they had to do that because conditions of low flows and high temperatures create really stressful conditions for the aquatic communities, the aquatic critters, namely the fish. But the added pressure from anglers and boaters passing over those habitats can be really detrimental in the long term. So when we are facing those levels of severe drought and low flows, it's important to not disturb any more than need be. So these pictures, this is showing that the Yampa River is closed. I took these, they're not Kent's wonderful pictures, but these signs by CPW and City of Steamboat could be found all along just different access points, any spur trail onto the river. And then this photo right here, I took, you can see my reflection, in a river outfitter shop window. A lot of people kind of skirted the topic of climate change in those interviews, but these folks were not shy about it, and they would not be wrong either. Okay, all of that leads us to the methodology and results of the project that I conducted. So all of this just underscores the importance of the water conservation work that Friends of the Yampa and many incredibly dedicated and thoughtful people are tackling. So let's take a look at some of that work and get into how this capstone supports it. So my capstone helped support the Yampa River Scorecard project. Just starting generally about river report cards, they are a commonly used tool that captures many components of the health of a watershed and particular river and the communities that depend on it as a resource. So river report cards compile all sorts of data. They measure a ton of specific quantities, but the three major areas pictured here, social are ecological, social, and economic. And river report cards are distinctive because they're a prime example of the adaptive management process in action. They river report cards require continual planning and updating, taking cabs on what's working, what's not working, monitoring, seeing what needs to be remeasured, and upkeep of the data, and adapting to that process to make sure it stays effective and efficient. These two figures here on the bottom are from the World Wildlife Fund. World Wildlife Fund created a practitioner's guide to developing river report cards, and they detail the process very thoroughly. Friends of the Yampa leaned heavily on this publication, but this Mississippi River Watershed Report Card is just an example. But just to state that specifically, Friends of the Yampa started this past year their own river report card called the Yampa River Scorecard Project. The Scorecard Project is highly collaborative, works with many different entities, different partners They have a technical committee sort of advising the process, along with a stakeholder group focus committee as well, and some agencies providing funding or technical support. But the three main study areas of the scorecard project that coincide with those three areas in the World Wildlife Fund figure here are ecological health and functioning, ecosystem services and river uses, and then finally people and community benefits. So the overarching goal of the scorecard project is to convey science and river management to all people in a fun and exciting way. These are their words, not mine. That stimulates community awareness and engagement with the Yampa River and its unique attributes. So this iteration of the scorecard project is in its first go right now. It'll be adapted and expanded upon in the future, but it's focused on a pilot stretch from the town of Hayden to the town of Craig. So encompasses a little bit of Routt County, a little bit of Moffat County, but it'll be adapted to be implemented on further sections in years to come. So this is just a starting point. My interviews focused on interviewing people just in that stretch, and just kind of state, but my project itself kind of fits into that people and community benefits section. So some scorecard outcomes, just going back to river report cards in general and what they aim to achieve. Here on the left, World Wildlife published that practitioner's guide. And from their processes, this is a little bit of what they measured the effectiveness of, but they showed some specific benefits that come from report cards. The two I want to highlight here are the two main components that my capstone was leveraging in hopes to increase overall for the Yampa scorecard project. So given the feedback from report cards that have been published and produced, we see that the respondents of the report card increased public awareness of issues, and 84% of respondents said that the report cards increased the demand for additional information. And this here is just an example of a finished scorecard project done by Friends of the Verde in Arizona. Yes, Arizona. But quickly, a purpose statement for my capstone itself is to overall foster a sense of ownership with stakeholders in the process of the Yampa River Scorecard project. Additionally, I wanted to promote engagement from community members and the general public, and I aim to do this by providing a unique medium for understanding the science and study areas of the scorecard, in addition to those unique features of the Yampa River. And this is all to develop a sense of connection with the conservation needs of the river for people who know it well and can enjoy it and connect back to those specific places, or people who may not be able to get out there physically. So some of the methodology, just to reiterate, like I mentioned way earlier, for my deliverable, I created a story map to detail the scorecard process and stakeholder input. But in terms of methodology I used in this process of the project, there were 3 phases and outcomes, specific outcomes for each phase. But those phases were to conduct interviews, and then I coded those interviews. And finally, from the results of that code book, I built a narrative to share via the story map. And that the methodology here was informed by that literature review I mentioned. And the some key pieces from that review, I just wanted to state that there were recommendations to create a clear protagonist, which I portrayed as folks whose livelihoods depend on the river, but the river basin's health. And the World Wildlife Fund guide suggested to take feature reporters on a trip to key stretches of the river and introduce them to people who depend on the river basin's health. So that's really the goal here, because not everyone can get out and meet the people and see the river for themselves. But let's just take a look a little more closely at each phase. So 2 phases to my interview conducting. First, I created scripts to identify folks to interview and conduct those interviews. But the first half, I did a practitioner consult of interview questions to ask specific individual stakeholder groups like the agricultural community, recreation, and environmental folks. And then I took those drafts to conservation practitioners in those different areas. And I just really wanted to get their feedback and input on specific questions to bring to stakeholders, like what I wanted to ask ranchers or other ag folks in the more general phase. And these organizations listed here were the where folks, those conservation professionals, I interviewed them from. So Community Ag Alliance focuses on the ranching community, Trout Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, all here in North Carolina. But after that sort of consultation phase, I conducted the interviews with individual stakeholders. And the goal of these interviews was to collect historical accounts and stories, but as well as their individual perspectives on things like different management practices and their personal definition of a healthy river. So these were semi-structured interviews. I had a set of questions that I asked everyone, and then I left time for individuals to share their own stories and insights, whatever they thought to be most relevant. And these are just a few examples of the questions that I asked everyone. Just to name a few, describe how your ability to make a living depends on the river. And then what does a healthy Yampa River mean to you? So in the second phase, I coded all those interviews. I transcribed, wrote them out, and then created a code book to identify different major themes and sub-themes. This figure here just shows really just a couple of the themes that came up many times throughout. And in a little bit, I'm going to share some quotes and other insight on these major themes that I thought were highly relevant and worth sharing with you all. But here I've listed some of these themes as a healthy river. Some sub-themes were allyship and common goals. We also saw livelihoods come up a whole lot, which I've talked a lot about, ranching and recreation being two of those major ones. Climatic conditions, drought and climate change being another theme and sub-theme, pairing management perspectives, including water storage. Some folks say we need more, some folks say, why do we even have any at all? And then the non-native invasive species management, and then water rights came up. I don't want to get too much into that, but in-stream flows and priority, that first in time, first in right. But COVID-19 also came up a lot because it is impacting people's livelihoods in a lot of ways. So with that, I compared across those coded transcripts. I translated the most common themes that I just named into a basis for a narrative from stakeholder groups, and I used those to create the interactive story map components, largely the map tours and timelines. But really the intention here was just to create a narrative to show how complex the myriad of water uses on the river are, and what at the same time what challenges the river is facing. Right now, I'd love to be able to walk you through the story map I created for the sake of time, and also the fact that it's not published yet. It's still under revision with Friends of the Yampa. Just a very sneak preview of the story map. But here, this is just kind of what the cover page looks like. You'll be able to scroll through and go into all these different categories and do some interactive map tours, read a little bit of those interviews, and really see what's important to different people, the technical committee, the stakeholder groups, everyone who loves the Yampa. And a couple of those sections, the first half is just general, what the technical committees fleshed out, the scorecard goals and outcomes, and what goes into that process, and then the geographic and ecological features, similar to what I walked you through earlier. But then the second half of that story map is specific to my capstone. So that the third section is a series of interactive map tours with those major themes that I identify with stakeholder interviews. And then I have an interactive timeline of events that interviewees described as based on the history of the Yampa. things like the major legislation or drought and flood events. But in all of the sections all throughout, I provide links to outside sources and websites, planning documents, management plans, so folks can learn more on whatever they may be interested in and getting their friends, family, neighbors also interested. So let's look a little bit more closely at some of those major themes that I identified. Since the overarching goal of the project is to convey river health, I wanted to highlight some of those quotes from stakeholders about what they think a healthy river is. So we're starting here, and I have really quotes from each major stakeholder group. But from an ag producer, I heard that a healthy river makes us all healthy. And for me, a healthy river means I can produce a ton of hay per acre for my cows. Oh, whoops. For the recreation side of things, I heard different iterations of this, but a healthy river means you can see the impact up and down the valley. It means good snowpack and nice flow fully to the banks. It's sustainable, lots of water. It's less allocations, less diverting the water out of the river. On a good water year, everybody is happy. And then from the environmental side, we heard we've got the 4 endangered fish species, the declining and threatened species, the riparian forest, and the hydrograph of the river. So a healthy river to me requires that we meet the needs of all those attributes and the needs of everything else. And if we can't do that, we are failing. Next major theme, livelihoods. Again, starting with ag. Hopefully people will be able to continue to make a living out here. We can't get rich off of it, but we do need to be able to make a living off of it. We need to keep the tractors running, keep the horse trailers moving, keep the buildings in repair. We need to be able to go down and dig out our ditch. We need to be able to fix that head gate when it crashes, and we need to be nimble and always forward looking. Recreationally, livelihoods, water in the river is so central to my business. I need the CFS in the river. Without CFS in there, it seriously hurts my business. And CFS is cubic feet per second. It's just a measure of flows and flow level of water. And then finally, water rights came up in literally every single conversation I ever had about the river in any way, shape, or form. But in the beginning, we were viewed as threats to everyone else. Oh, this is from the environment. In the beginning, we were viewed as threats to everyone else because we cared about water for the environment and fish, but we didn't have a water right. And at that time, water for the environment, water for recreation was pretty much unheard of. And the in-stream flows that I mentioned earlier, that's water for the environment, and which was again mentioned with recreation. In-stream water rights are very important to us. Water in the river is what we rely on. And as we see less snowpack, we see less recreation, and that impacts our business humongously. And a fun fact before I move into just wrapping, or the last piece on water rights, for the agricultural realm, the oldest water rights, the most senior water rights on the Yampa River belong to the Carpenter Ranch, which is in Hayden, Colorado. It's actually a nature conservancy property, which is an easement area, but it researches cattle ranching practices that optimize the riparian ecosystem health. So it's a super cool operation that they have going there, and they have the oldest water rights on the Yampa. So speaking of ag and water rights, we as the ag, even owning the water rights and whatever that we can take off the river, we shouldn't be doing things to the river that degrade or minimize or marginalize the things that the rest of the river has to do or has to offer. I feel that the people that are with the environment and the recreation, they can be my allies and I can be their ally. So with that, all those themes and quotes, it is obvious that many folks depend on a stable and a reliable Yampa River. My hope with the scorecard project and my role within it, I hope that I can help people understand what that means and how they can help. I just wanted to wrap up with some conclusions quickly before we get to Q&A, but if nothing else, I would just want you to take away, and my concluding point here is that a healthy Yampa River or a healthy river system generally looks different to every individual, and it's really an effort to unify all of those ideals and all those visions. There are some unifying features of a healthy river, and that's in those major themes. That's to support livelihoods, to support well-being, especially amidst the uncertainties and changing climatic conditions. But let's take a minute and bring that back to the Southeast. So Western North Carolina is also seeing population growth, but the water resources here are facing a different set of challenges, from pollution from urban activities and growth, especially the land disturbing activities, which result in major sedimentation. That's one of the biggest threats to our waterways. In terms of climate change impact affecting river systems, they look a bit different here, as opposed to the intense drought. Here we see some overwhelming flooding events such as that of Hurricane Fred last summer, but you can see those stark impacts in some places remarkably, but one of the most visible in MountainTrue's southern region is in that area in Transylvania County and Pisgah National Forest, when Hurricane Fred came through last summer. But just like in the Yampa Valley, there are many hardworking people, folks who are dedicated to protecting our water resources, professionals and volunteers alike, who really innately understand and recognize the value that clean water brings to us and brings to the aquatic life that depends on having clean water. So efforts similar to the Yampa River Scorecard project are happening right here too. One example is MountainTrue's State of the River report, and it's honestly such a privilege to get to be a part of that work, and just get little glimpses and insights and understanding what all goes into it. But it has been great to witness all of that, and it's been great to tell you all about my work. I think with that, I'm kind of done rambling, but I just want to thank you all for tuning in and taking time to learn about the Yampa River and just thinking about what a healthy river means and how that can look different to all of us. So with that, I will take some time for questions, and Savannah is here. She's going to help me field, I hope. But with that, I'm going to turn over to questions.
I do have one question for you, Mara.
Yeah, go ahead.
My question would be, was there anything when you were doing all of your research that really surprised you?
I found it surprising that I highlighted some of the like ranching folks, those producers, but they said that they had sort of a collaborative, really cooperative approach to water management. I by no means heard that from everyone, and it's a far cry from I think where it could be, but it was surprising to get that like allyship quote. And yeah, that was surprising. I think there's so many other things, but that was one of the big ones.
Yeah, that's interesting. How about, was there any like big major challenges you faced when you did this project?
COVID made it really hard. I will be honest. I mean, like emailing people to get out. It's just not easy to have these sort of in-depth conversations and really be able to ask what you want to in a personal way over Zoom. So I did get to go out and have some in-person meetings. Those are always by far and away better, but COVID made it really hard. That's the main one.
That makes perfect sense. We have some questions coming in. So I have one from Erica, and she said, love this work that you've done, Mara, and look forward to more talks about especially the agriculture world. A question for you was, were agriculture producers at the roundtable that you spoke about?
Thanks, Erica. Yes, great question. Yes, so the roundtable has so many different representatives from different stakeholder areas. And one of them is the agricultural community. So actually, I did get to interview the sitting representative. He was actually also a county commissioner for Moffat County. But he had a lot to say about water management and diversions, and they are a big part of representing the Yampa's water needs and bringing that from the Yampa White Green Basin Roundtable to the state at large in the Colorado Water Plan. I hope that answers your question. If not, follow up with me.
We have another question from Kevin, and Kevin is asking, how do local community members feel about the Endangered Species Act and the listed fish species in the Yampa River Basin?
That is an excellent question, Kevin. I appreciate you asking that. The Endangered Species Act can be a bit of a contentious topic because some people don't agree with or appreciate protecting water for water's sake and the fact that it supports more than just us as humans. So the Endangered Species Act, a lot of folks want to be able to just continue diverting water from the river and taking away from those in-stream flows. And those listed fish species in the basin, that changing categories of the humpback chub was actually supported because that means there were different stretches along the river where the habitat was improved to a certain degree to be able to take it from the endangered to threatened. But it is got some split perspectives there on the Endangered Species Act. And again, I hope that answers your question. If not, I can elaborate, or always feel free to reach out and can chat more about it.
I think that's it for our questions right now, Mara, but what I'll do since you're sharing your screen is I'll drop your email in the chat. So if anybody who's here, if you have any additional questions, please reach out to Mara.
Yes, I'd love to hear from you. And I know the Zoom fatigue is real, so it means a lot that you showed up, paid attention, asked questions, and I appreciate it and hope you all have a really wonderful evening and keep thinking about the Yampa River because it's a super special place.
Awesome. Thank you guys. We hope you have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.